Started now. So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on to this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I'm on the programming team here at Cary Library. Before we begin, just a few things to note. Please let me know in the chat if there are any technical issues that I can try to resolve. If you have any questions or comments, please submit them via the Q&A button and they'll be addressed at the end. This program was made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation and Lexington Living Landscapes. This is in continuation of a series of presentations in which Cary Library is partnering with Lexington Living Landscapes to bring experts in landscape and conservation issues to the public. So now please welcome Charlie Watman.
Great, thank you, Matt. And I'm just going to share my screen. Just to, there we go. Nope. Actually, sorry, just a second. Sorry, I will be with you in just 1 second. This is Zoom, right? This is what always happens with Zoom. All right, and now we're going to do this and this. And I'm going to leave it like that so it doesn't cover my entire screen, and I will get started. So thank you. Good evening and welcome. We're delighted to have you with us this evening. Before I turn the floor over to Rebecca, I'd like to say a few words about Lexington Living Landscapes, which is hosting this evening's talk along with our friends at Cary Library. Lexington Living Landscapes was launched a little over a year ago for the purpose of encouraging and promoting more sustainable landscaping practices in town. So more native plants, fewer invasives, fewer chemicals, more trees. We were created as a partnership among 4 organizations, the town's Sustainable Lexington Committee and 3 nonprofits, the Lexington Field and Garden Club, the Lexington Climate Action Network, and Citizens for Lexington Conservation. We pursue our mission through education and advocacy, providing the information and tools you need to make your yards and neighborhoods healthier, more nature-friendly, and resilient places to live. To plug into what we do, you need to note just 2 addresses which are on the screen. One is our website where we have lots of informational resources and links, and our email address by which you can ask us to put you on our mailing list for our newsletter that we send out every 4 to 6 weeks. The next one is going out on Friday, so if you'd like to receive it, let us know tonight or tomorrow. We want to thank Rebecca for agreeing to join us this evening and sharing her wisdom and enthusiasm for the natural world. We want to thank Matt and the Cary Library for hosting this webinar, and we are grateful to both Cary and the Lexington Conservation Division for helping to underwrite this evening's program. After Rebecca talks, we'll have a Q&A session moderated by another member of the Living Landscapes team, Sarah Bothwell-Allen. If you have questions, just put them in the Q&A, not the chat, please, and Sarah will pull them out and toss them to Rebecca at the end of her program. You are in for a treat this evening. I've heard Rebecca speak twice in the last year, and after the first time, I knew this evening's program would be the perfect antidote for the midwinter blues. Her day job is as Director of Horticulture at Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is an extraordinary 85-acre expanse of sustainably managed parkland fashioned out of industrial land, including piers on the Brooklyn side of the East River. If you're interested, you've got 2 great opportunities to hear Rebecca talk about it. Through the recorded talk she gave to Grow Native Massachusetts last year, and at a talk she'll be giving to the Minnesota chapters of Wild Ones, the Wisconsin-based sustainable landscaping organization, on February 16th. I'll put links to both in the chat. When Rebecca isn't at the park, she writes about landscape management and pollination ecology, as well as designs the occasional garden. Her writing has been published by the New York Times, the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and the Landscape Institute. Rebecca, thank you for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Sorry.
It's okay. All right, here I go. And yeah, so I'm at Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is this park that's in the middle of New York City. And we get 5 million people that visit there every year, way more than 5 million. That was just one count we did years ago. And we also manage the 85 acres of land at the park as wildlife habitat. So the whole goal of that project is to show that people and wildlife can coexist in the middle of a city. It's an amazing, amazing project. But of course, the techniques to do this are just being discovered now. We're researching them and sharing them. Other folks are as well. Hopefully you all are doing the same work. But in order to learn how to do that stuff, it's really important to understand the basic dynamics of what's going on between plants and animals and soil microorganisms. And so my passion, that's my day job, right? My passion is pollination ecology. I just love, love, love it. And, it's really the most fascinating thing I can possibly imagine. It's sex, right? It's awesome. And flowers, the most beautiful stuff ever. And it's just the most wonderful thing. And I think, as Charlie said, in these crazy, crazy times, it's truly wonderful to know that these really magical processes are happening all around us. And as gardeners, it's just this incredible opportunity to sit around and stare at these things in the garden. So flowers are, as we know, they're if they're not the most beautiful things on planet Earth, they're at least among them. But they're not just there to look pretty, right? They're there to get attention, certainly. It's part of what they do, but their job is reproduction. And in order to do that, in order to get the pollen to transfer to a stigma, flowers employ an absolutely staggering and awe-inspiring range of strategies. And almost all of them are invisible to the vast majority of people. So today I'm going to hopefully show you what flowers are doing. To talk, this Feed the Bees campaign is so incredibly popular. I'm going to talk about life from a flower's perspective and try and share with you why they get our attention, why they smell so wonderful, and why they look so pretty. But then I really want to encourage you to take this information and then go use it. Obviously not right now, unless you have houseplants that are blooming, but take this information into the field in spring and really try and see these processes in action, because the goal, of course, is going to be to get you to connect to the natural world in a deeper way. So pollination, as I mentioned, is plant sex. It's the transfer of male genes to the female organs. And in plants, the male genes are in the pollen, right? And the pollen is in here in these anthers. And then, and it has to make its way to the female parts of the flower. So it gets, the anthers digest, and the pollen transfers over here, over to hopefully a different plant stigma. And then that pollen grain sitting here in this moist stigma, which we'll look at, will germinate just like a seed. And a pollen tube grows all the way down the style and then into an ovule where it fertilizes. And then, theoretically you get a new plant eventually. And so, but that whole process is much more than pollination. Pollination is simply the transfer of that pollen from the anther to the stigma. It's bang, bang. Everything after that is fertilization. Pollination is just that little movement right there. And you can see it here really clearly on this lily. You can see that those anthers have tons of pollen. They're super digest, ready to stain your clothing. And that stigma, again, even has a dollop of nectar on it, which we'll look at in a little bit. So there are 4 main ways to get pollinated as a flower. The first and the biggest are animals, and a full 80% of plants on planet Earth are animal pollinated. Bees and butterflies are the most popular and familiar pollinators, of course, but beetles are huge, huge pollinators, and wasps and flies, and of course moths are all major pollinators. Of course, once in a million, you get like a lizard or a lemur, and we just don't have time for that, unfortunately, today. We're just going to talk about the big ones. But the big question here is, why would an animal pollinate a flower? And the answer is that they're either getting something in exchange or they're being tricked. But mostly they're eating pollen and nectar. They're just eating it. And while they're doing that, the flower is sticking that pollen, the flower's pollen, to their body. And when the animal visits another flower of the same species, hopefully, they deliver that pollen to a receptive stigma. So the flowers are trading pollen and nectar, and sometimes oils, for pollination. They're essentially outsourcing the process of having sex. But 20% of plants are not visited by animals. They are wind pollinated. Here's our pines right here. And they're abiotically pollinated, sorry. And then most of those abiotically pollinated plants are wind pollinated. And they just, most of the time, wind pollinated plants just release their pollen to the wind, right? And those are pine trees as pictured, and grasses as well. There's also a couple other strategies that are very, very rare. And one is called selfing. And that is where plants don't get to have sex. They just fertilize their own flower, and their seeds are essentially clones of themselves. And this is almost always a backup strategy, because organisms, of course, want to have sex. They want to exchange genes. But when conditions aren't right, it's helpful and even critical to be able to have this option. And so here, right here on this slide, you can see a picture of the common blue violet, our wonderful common blue violet. And we all recognize this flower from spring. But in summer, underneath the ground, they also form these flowers. And you can dig up this plant in your yard this summer and see them. And these flowers form underground. They're called cleistogamous flowers, and they never properly bloom. They simply fertilize themselves under the ground. And then when the seeds are ripe, they tip themselves up and distribute the seeds above the ground. And so it's a marvelous backup strategy to have. And then lastly, over here in this image, you can see that there are just very, very, very few water pollinated plants. So just quickly to mention that there's so much more to this conversation that I don't have time to get into. But we humans are incredibly dependent on this process to survive. And I'm sure everyone knows that here. But a full third of the food we eat is utterly reliant on pollination. And there are some places on Earth where we've literally destroyed that entire process, and people actually have to hand pollinate fruits like apples. And so our fates are truly linked. And we have to protect pollinators as a matter of self-preservation. But also, these organisms just simply have integrity beyond their, quote unquote, ecological services. They deserve to live on Earth, and they're woven into dependent relationships with everything else. So if you remove key pollinators, you lose the specialist flowers that rely on them, and you lose the birds that eat them. These are the webs that we as ecological horticulture practitioners are trying to support. It's just not always about one of those organisms, it's about all of these dynamics among them. So this is a rose, right? This is just a really one of the most basic flowers we can look at. You can see all the anthers all around right here, these little hot dog buns. And this is the stigmatic center right here. And this is what we call a perfect flower. So it has both male and female flowers. Other flowers like these begonias can be male or female. You can see here, this is on the same plant. This is a male flower with little anthers, and a female flower. And if you've ever had begonias, you can actually hand pollinate them yourself. You can take off a male flower and rub it on the female flower when it's ready, and grow new begonias that way. It's one of the joys of having begonias. And then of course, some plants, as we know, like ilex, the entire plant itself is either male or female. And you have to make sure that you have a certain number of males in order to get berries on your females. And then there are even some plants like red maples that will switch back and forth from male to female, depending on conditions. And most of that has to do with stress. And so it's a wide rainbow, right, of scenarios with plant flowers. But lots of perfect flowers, as the flowers with male and female parts are called, they still don't want to pollinate themselves, right? It's not their first strategy. And so they often have a mechanism wherein, like on this geranium on the same plant, the flower when it first opens is male. And you can see those anthers are getting ready to digest, and the stigma in the center has not opened and is not receptive. And then over here, after all of the pollen has left these anthers, this stigma is open and receptive. So this is this flower's strategy for not getting self-pollinated. And flowers have so many different amazing strategies for not being self-pollinated. A lot of the flowers that we think of as flowers aren't even flowers. They're flower heads, like on the sunflower. And of course, all the composites, they're actually comprised of thousands, hundreds, if not thousands, of what we call florets. which are these tiny little flowers here, which are perfect. They're perfect male and female flowers, and they have a fantastic mechanism. It's very interesting where each individual floret in the asters, the stigma actually pushes the pollen up. The pollen is like released on the inside, and the stigma's job is pushing the pollen up and then becoming receptive after that. And so it's just an interesting pollen presentation as well. And you can see here on this coneflower, that's that same basic mechanism where there's all these florets that are individual little flowers. And all of this yellow ring around here is the pollen that is available. So only these florets on this ring are blooming on this flower. And then as they bloom, the next ring, after these ones finish blooming, then the next ring blooms inside. And you can watch bees do this adorable little dance or march as they walk around the flower head. And then of course, as the florets on the outside are pollinated and the seeds start ripening on the inside, that's what grows the cone of the coneflower, are all of those seeds on the inside. And those spikes on the coneflower are actually a self-defense mechanism that the flower has developed in order not to be eaten by the wrong animals. And you can see here, if you look closely, there's those little flowers up there, florets, blooming. And this little bee is going to do a tight little circle all the way on the top of the flower. Another thing to notice is that these florets are really easy to get to, right? They're not difficult the way that certain flowers are. And so it looks like my screen is frozen. Let's see, I'm going back. All right, so everyone can get to these flowers. A fly, like this hoverfly, has access to them. A butterfly can easily get to them. So these are what we call generalist flowers. The flower is pretty much there to provide resources to just about anyone who comes along, and is hoping that a good percentage of those animals are going to also visit a flower of the same species and pass along their pollen to the next flower. So they're generalists. They're there for just about anyone. But different flowers have different strategies. And I'm trying to show you a flower in the lupin family, which in the pea family, which is a lupin. Here we go. And so these flowers are completely different. They're a lock and key mechanism, and they are not a specialist. They're not a generalist, they're a specialist. And so they've developed a partnership with bumblebees, and bumblebees are great animals to specialize with because they're big, they can fly really far, and they are faithful. When they go out to forage for a day, they generally forage at one specific species and stick to that species, as opposed to something like a honeybee, which will go from a clover to an apple to a daisy. And so none of those plants are getting pollinated. Whereas a bumblebee in this case has a lot of flower constancy is what it's called, and they'll visit. And so this plant, this lupin, doesn't want just anyone to visit it. It has a puzzle that has to be solved. And so you can see in this video here of me pushing down these petals, these specialized petals that are hiding the reproductive organs of the flower, pushing them down and exposing them. And that's what a bumblebee does. Bumblebees are great problem solvers. While they go and they push their back legs down, and they're the only ones who know how to solve this puzzle. And it's the same for many flowers in the pea family. You can watch them do this. I highly recommend just doing it yourself. It's pretty fun. There are, of course, examples of extreme specialization as well, like this bear claw poppy in Utah. This flower has one bee that pollinates it, the bear claw poppy bee. And of course, they're both endangered now. And so it's very, very rare. This sort of extreme specialization is incredibly rare. Normally, there's at least a few pollinators and at least a few plants, and everyone's hedging their bets and taking advantage of what they can. And you have to imagine that when this dynamic first formed, there were many, many flowers and many, many bees, and this made sense to form this extreme specialization. But you can see that now climate change and environmental disturbance has, really threatened these environments. It's become a very risky dynamic. So there's always these balances back and forth with these organisms. And that's really the case with specialists, right? They're delicate. They're delicate organisms that we are always trying to protect at Brooklyn Bridge Park. We are thrilled to see Bombus impatiens. It's wonderful, but we get really excited when we see a blueberry digger bee that can't raise their babies without blueberry pollen, because that's a delicate, special dynamic that are the first things to be broken when there are environmental disturbances. And that shows that there's quality habitat there, right? There's a lot of people get really excited about feeding the bees, and it's like so wonderful, but it's far more exciting to see these more delicate dynamics being supported. So this is a soy flower, and also obviously in the pea family. And this is a flower that is exclusively, it's been bred over thousands upon thousands of years, and it doesn't ever open, and it isn't really pollinated hardly at all. There's very, very tiny levels of open pollination. And that can also be good in agricultural settings, because as a farmer, you get really reliable crops year after year after year. So people have done very interesting things with pollination as well. But of course, the earth didn't always look like this, right? Long ago, there were no flowers. And plants moved onto land about 500 million years ago, and they came from the water. And they've relied on water to reproduce, of course, because their sperm swam. And sperm still swims for like literally every organism. Primitive plants like mosses and ferns, they can't reproduce without a film of water for these processes to play out on. And you can actually watch videos online, and it's incredible to see how like mammalian they still look. And so what a lot of organisms did in order to go from this aquatic environment into the terrestrial environment was to take an aquatic system and essentially internalize it, right? If you think about it, that's what we've done and mammals have done. We've essentially internalized an aquatic process, and it can stay aquatic essentially. And so for terrestrial plants to adapt to this condition, they needed to move sperm through the air. And plants figured out how to do that by enclosing their sperm in a tiny wax spaceship called pollen. The outer coating of pollen is amazing at keeping pollen from drying out as it moves from one moist environment inside the anther to the next moist environment, which is on that stigma. If you remember that dollop of nectar on the stigma, that literally will rehydrate everything that is in the pollen and allow the germination to take place there and for fertilization to happen. So plants like pine trees figured this out. But of course, these are still cones, right? These are not real flowers. And their pollen was moved around by the wind. And their seeds also, importantly, were not covered in fruit, like an apple seed is today. They're gymnosperms, which literally means naked seed. But over time, about 150 million years ago, although that number keeps getting pushed back, gymnosperm seeds started to evolve a covering that protected them from insects and from predators. And key insect groups also started eating their pollen and then relying on them as a food source. And then that just completely changed the face of the earth forever, because plants started relying on insects to move their pollen around rather than the wind. And then they began offering pollen to insects in more attractive packages, and thus we got flowers. And that, along with those seed protections, meant that flowering plants took over the world so quickly that Charles Darwin famously called them an abominable mystery. They couldn't figure out, no one could figure out how flowering plants just completely proliferated everywhere. And to this day, we've got around 250,000 species of flowering plants, of angiosperms, and literally 800 to 900 gymnosperms. So really, they're incredibly effective, right? These processes of covering your seeds and then having pollination is incredibly effective, and not only proliferation, but really speciation and driving evolution and diversification. Because for the first time, pollen can be transferred outside of a small population, right? If you're wind pollinated, things are really moving within your community. But if you've got an agent of change moving around, that bee could maybe transfer to the other side of the mountain. And so the diversification just absolutely explodes. And then you also have this intelligent partner who's part of the pollination process at this point. So flowers are getting flashier and they're sending out aromas. And I think it's just wonderful because people tend to think of insects as really mechanically minded, but all of the flowers we think of as literally the height of beauty were painstakingly crafted and selected by insects over eons. And they are these magnificent artists. And one of the reasons I love knowing this stuff is because I can look at a southern magnolia and thank a beetle for that. And then just thank these completely garish bees who literally demand such extravagance and give us things like irises, that they're really just like incredible designers. So the first pollinators were beetles and wasps, and beetles were these big scarab beetles, and they weren't trying to pollinate anything, they were just eating. And so the first flowers had to hold these big beetles, and so the first flowers, like magnolias, are big fleshy cups, and they had robust petals that would hold a beetle. And at this point, there were no bees, only wasps, and they were carnivores. The wasps, like many wasps today, like the vast majority of wasps, would feed their young meat. And even today, you do see, wasps like this one on flowers, but they do, almost all wasps feed, like there's always exceptions, it's nature, but almost all wasps will feed their young meat. They'll either collect grasshopper and lay an egg on it, or they'll parasitize another organism and lay their eggs within another organism. But they still would take advantage of this free resource of pollen. And so some of these wasps over time started more and more relying on this pollen. And then some of those wasps started feeding it to their babies. And that switch, those wasps became bees. So bees are essentially vegetarian wasps, and they formed this intricate relationship with flowers that really allowed flowers to evolve to the level that they've evolved. This incredible relationship. There's lots of other organisms that are amazing pollinators, but bees and flowers have this true relationship that they're feeding to their babies. Of course, there are many other organisms like moths that will occasionally feed their babies like pollen, but the relationship between bees and flowers is really incredible. It's a really strong link. And that's how they came about. That's how flowers came about. But at this point today, they do a lot more than just provide nectar and pollen. They make a great shelter, and a lot of insects will sleep in flowers. These are male longhorn bees that they spend the day. You can see this on any like Rudbeckia they'll spend the day fighting each other around the flowers. The male will just zoom around and fight each other. And then at night, they literally will snuggle up into the flower together to sleep. It's incredibly cute. And a lot of flowers like this little geranium, this is another longhorn bee that I found, they face the sun and they're a satellite shape. And so they're multiple degrees warmer than the ambient air. And so a lot of bees will sleep in there and take advantage of that space. Here's another little bee sleeping in a flower. This is another specialist bee, the rose mallow bee, and the hibiscus in our park. And some flowers, of course, don't just collect heat. They actually make it themselves. This is the Amorphophallus titanum, the gigantic stinkhorn flowers, and it's one of the largest flowers in the world, if not the largest flower, and it's fly pollinated. And of course, in a jungle, right, where it's dark, it needs to, a lot of plants in those environments, they really spread a very strong aroma, right? They can't rely on visual communication quite as strongly as those out in the sun. And so a lot of jungle flowers or even nighttime flowers have a strong aroma like this. And because this one is fly pollinated, that strong aroma is fetid meat. They're really trying to attract flies with horrible smells, and they try to look like fetid meat as well. That purple coloration, that dark maroon coloration, is an attempt to look like that meat. And you can see that they actually get pretty hot. The tip of the spadix is as hot as we are, and it's this incredible process. But even some of our native plants do the same thing. This is a skunk cabbage flower. This is our first flower to bloom in the spring, and it sometimes blooms in March. And you can see a little melted ring of snow around it in Connecticut, where I'm from. And that is because this is doing the exact same thing. It is creating heat to attract flies. And it is also that maroon and white coloration is supposed to mimic that mottled color of meat for lucky flies in the spring. And because flies are reliable places to find pollinators, there are whole food webs that are based around hunting on flowers. This is a crab spider who caught a flower fly. And the crab spiders are wonderful creatures that they actually can change color depending on the flower. I've seen them change from white to yellow, depending on the flower that they're on. And often the best way to find a crab spider is to find an unusually still bee. You can't really see the spider very easily, but the bees themselves you can see. Flowers are also great places to get it on. Of course, the males know that the females are going to be there. And so you can often see action like this happening. But the broader point here is simply that flowers are far more complex and interesting, truly, than just a place to get food, right? That's not just what's going on. They're full ecosystems in and of themselves. Wind pollination we're just going to touch on this very quickly. But, insect pollinated flowers have all these incredible tricks and techniques, and they're flashy. But wind pollination is also like truly, truly wonderful because it kind of gets a bad reputation sometimes. People think it's primitive because it evolved first, or that it's unintelligent because there's no animals involved, but it really is awfully elegant. So as I mentioned, slightly less than 20% of plants are wind pollinated. And of course, all conifers are wind pollinated, but even some flowering plants like this maple here evolved back into being wind pollinated after already having insect pollinated flowers. So there's some benefits sometimes to being wind pollinated as well. I mean, generally, wind pollination is an incredibly expensive strategy. The percentage of pollen that actually hits another flower is absolutely minuscule compared to the amount of pollen that is produced. But there are a lot of things that wind pollinated plants don't need to do. So if you're being honest with yourself, you've probably never seen this flower. There's very few of us, even in horticulture, who have noticed this flower. And that's because flowers that are wind pollinated don't need to get anyone's attention. And so they're green, they're diminutive, and the plants don't need to waste resources on things like petals or nectar, and which are also incredibly expensive. And they also have lots of interesting strategies to make their pollination as efficient as possible. So this is a spring maple in bloom, and you'll notice that it's flowering when there are no leaves on the tree. And so the pollen is moving around the tree, and it can move through the tree, right? And so if there were leaves, the pollen might hit all the leaves, but it's a common strategy for wind pollinated plants to bloom before there are leaves out so that they can be more efficient at moving that pollen around. A lot of wind pollinated plants like grasses will grow in large groups, like a field, so that when they send out their pollen, it's just like a cloud of pollen all around. Let's see, come on, computer. Like so. And I don't have time, unfortunately, to get into this properly, but a lot of wind pollination is like fluid dynamics. If you think about it, like if you imagine that there's a slowly flowing stream and a rock in a stream, and you put a leaf in that stream, the leaf is cruising down. It's not going to smash into the rock, right? It's going to be carried around the rock. That's because there's a boundary layer of water around that rock, where the water right next to the rock is moving slower and then faster, faster, faster as you get farther away from it and any object in the water. And that's the same thing with wind, right? And so if there's an object in the wind and a grain of pollen flowing by, it's not going to smash into that object. It's going to flow around it normally. And so plants that want to capture that pollen, they have a lot of strategies to get out of those boundary layers. And so like on this grass, this is Panicum virgatum. These are these exceptionally beautiful flowers. The anthers are dangling down to try and get out of that boundary layer. And the stigmas, these beautiful combs, will literally comb the air. And scientists have looked at the way that the grasses will oscillate in the wind as those stigmas comb through the air, seem to have been designed perfectly to move the grass through those boundary layers so that they can swoop up any passing by pollen. These are other grasses, other wind pollinated grasses that people often forget about. This is corn, of course, and they have their male flowers at the top to distribute that male pollen as far as possible. And here are the female flowers, right? Very familiar to us, these little ears of corn. And of course, those tiny little silks, those are the stigmas. So for every single kernel of corn that we eat, a grain of pollen needs to land on that stigma and travel, multiple inches. That pollen grain needs to travel, the pollen tube needs to travel multiple inches to fertilize the kernel of corn. And that process, you can actually control it. That's how we get rainbow corn. And if you've ever done that as a science experiment, it's really fun. You can take corn and take the blue corn and pollinate it with some red corn and make your own ear of corn in that way. It's pretty fun. Sorry, my computer is being strange. Okay, so even pine trees, they also have these wonderful little interesting tricks that they utilize. They are, truly maligned. Like a lot of people can't stand them, but of course they're not trying to get pollen onto your car. They want to be in a forest, surrounded by other pine trees, and then send out their pollen all at once. And so when pollen gets all over our stuff, that's not the plant's fault, right? That's the plant wanting to be in these environments surrounded by the same species. And there are also these incredibly beautiful forces at play where, again, if you imagine these boundary layers around the plants, it's hard to get a grain of pollen to go into a pine cone in here, right? Like they literally have to travel into the cone, down here, and into this tiny little space called a microfill, right? And so it's not by chance. They're actually elegantly evolved to create these tiny little eddies at each scale of the pine cone. So the chance of a grain of pollen finding its way into that location is drastically increased. And some people even think that the shape of a pine tree itself, that conical shape, is such that it moves pollen, the wind, around the tree to get the pollen to the right place as well. So there's these wonderful, wonderful processes. These, the plant here on the right is also wind pollinated. This, of course, is ragweed. Gardeners, I'm sure you recognize it. And many non-gardeners, of course, wouldn't recognize it. The plant on the left, of course, is goldenrod, which we all know and love. And goldenrod is bee pollinated. This is an animal pollinated plant. And you can tell, look how much attention it is trying to get. It is electric yellow. It evolved to get noticed. It wants to be noticed. And it is animal pollinated. And so the pollen that the goldenrod produces is big and sticky. It evolved to stick onto the legs of bumblebees, and it is not going to fly through the air. But of course, when it blooms at the same time, ragweed also blooms. And ragweed produces so much pollen, and it's such serious pollen that people die, like asthmatic people die every year from ragweed pollen. It's actually quite serious. Even though it's a native plant, it's important ecologically. Some people do remove it from their land, and rightfully so, for those reasons. But of course, because it's wind pollinated and it didn't evolve to be seen, people feel the effects of the ragweed, see the goldenrod, blame the goldenrod. And this dynamic is so common. If you Google ragweed, you get photos of goldenrod. And even my son's pediatrician one time told me that he clearly had a goldenrod allergy. But the reality is that because of the pollen of goldenrod is animal pollinated, the only way to get it into your nose is literally to place it there. It just doesn't fly through the air. The animal pollinated plants are not causing anybody allergies. So it's our job now to spread that information to as many people as possible. This plant is also trying to get noticed. So this is Iriscristada. This is one of our native irises. And it is also bee pollinated. And we look at this and we see beauty, but there is a ton of information that is also being passed along here, because flowers are also methods of communication. And so the nectar and pollen that the plants produce are very expensive. And so from the flowers' perspective, they want as many pollinators as possible to visit them quickly, take as little resources as possible, pollinate them thoroughly, and then fly away and visit another flower. And from the pollinators' perspective, foraging is both exhausting and dangerous. They just want to visit a few flowers, get a ton of pollen or nectar, and fly away. So neither side is messing around, right? It's really high stakes, and it's in both entities' interests to have this process be as clear as possible. So many flowers developed what are called nectar guides. They're these beautiful shapes here on these petals right here. And they're literally lines of dark and bright colors that show flying insects where the nectar is. And it's like a landing strip that is guiding in pilots. They're often yellow or have yellow in them. And the thinking with that is that they're literally advertising their pollen, which is also often yellow, at the same way that a pizza restaurant has like a giant slice of pizza. It's literally the exact same thing. And once you start noticing these nectar guides, they can't be unseen. They're a big part of what we find ornamental on flowers. They're everywhere and in all different shapes. They're absolutely beautiful. And there's a lot going on that we can't see, of course, as well, because we've got 3 color detecting cone cells in our eyes, and bees also have 3, but they're shifted farther into the ultraviolet spectrum. So here's us. Here's our cones here and where we can see in the light spectrum. And then here's bees. So they're way more into the ultraviolet spectrum. And so there's a lot of things going on in flowers that they can see that we can't see. But you'll also notice that bees can't see red quite as well as we can. And they really can't see it as well as birds can. And so we have one pollinating bird around here. We have the ruby-throated hummingbird, and they'll visit, they're very smart animals, and they'll test out a lot of different flowers, but red flowers are flowers that bees can't see. And so bees can't differentiate between red and green. They both kind of just look black to them. And so the birds know that those are those flowers. And so many, if not all of the hummingbird pollinated flowers up here, and even in the tropics, are red and yellow. And they also have 4 cones, so they can see into the ultraviolet spectrum as well as a little bit as well. So this is Rudbeckia as we see it. And this is what people think, what a bee sees it. And this is what people think a butterfly sees, although really we have no idea, because some butterflies, for our 3 photoreceptors and birds 4, some butterflies have 15 photoreceptors. So we're really just guessing at all of this, right? This comes from these really fun chat rooms online where people apply all these filters to things, and you can get a UV light and put it in your bathroom and bring flowers in. I highly recommend that as well. But what we've been told about the way that insects see is incorrect. One of the main things that we do know about the way that they see is that what is told to us in cartoons and in Hollywood, that it's a repeated image over and over for their compound eyes. This is incorrect. We know that this is not the case, that they actually, each one of the tiny sections of their compound eye is like a pixel, and they have like a very grainy, pixelated image in their vision. And so a lot of insects can't see very well compared to us. Of course, they're seeing completely different things, right? And they have different senses going on. But as far as just the plain vision part of things, it's not quite as clear as human vision, or so we think. But there are a lot of shapes and nectar guides that we can't see that are in that UV range. And again, these guides, they're passing along, they're advertising, right? To say, come on over, but they're also passing along information. And so especially with these bullet shapes, scientists think that they're showing pollinators where to go. They're actually like pointing the way in towards the nectar. And then with some of these shapes, they're also showing like how fast to approach a flower as well. There's a lot of information, and a bullet shape is or a bullseye shape is a really common one here. You can see even dandelions have them. And again, highly recommended to get a UV light and do this stuff at home. But even during the day, there's a lot of things going on here. And it's sort of this fun thing that you can't unsee, because if you look at these flowers, and of course, these are compound flower heads. When they first open, the individual florets are yellow, like on this aster. And these, of course, haven't been pollinated. And then after they are pollinated, within hours, they turn that maroon that, of course, bees can't see with their vision. And so if you're a bee and you're flying over this flower, the yellow is going to fluoresce and under UV light glows. And these are going to appear black. And so you can imagine bees just flying over these asters. And it's like, again, it's like these bright little lights that are showing them exactly where to land. And think about this process, right? Like if you're a bee or you're a flower, the last thing either group wants is for a bee to land and expend their energy trying to forage on a flower that doesn't have any resources. Neither organism wants that. And so they've developed these methods of communication. And again, like it's everywhere now that you can see it. You'll just see it absolutely everywhere. This is on a whitewood aster. This is on a clover that I noticed. You can see that they even, for each individual flower on a clover, once they've been pollinated, they'll move out of the way so that they're physically protected from maybe predation, and also not in anyone's way to be pollinated. And then they turn a little bit pink as well. And then on this catalpa, you can see if you look in the throat of the flower, that the nectar guides are yellow right here when the flowers first open. And then over time, as the flowers have been pollinated, the whole throat turns that maroon color, that purple color to tell pollinators that it's not worth visiting. And of course, flowers are communicating. Plants are changing colors to do this all the time, right? Like it's this incredible, it's like a ripening apple, right? It's like, it's so amazing to think about how we're being communicated to by plants as well. And then this, of course, is Virginia bluebells. And before the flowers, these are bumblebee pollinated. And before they're receptive, those flowers have that reddish pinkish tinge to them. And then as they open and become receptive, they become purple, which is of course, or that blue purple, which is of course far more UV reflective. So it's really happening all around us. And so, there's incredible other ways that just a couple years ago, researchers found that bees can literally see magnetic fields around flowers or sense magnetic fields around flowers. And this is real stuff. This is not just hippies. And they found that, a plant is essentially like a tube of water, right? And if you think about like the roots and the plant itself, and the charge of the earth is negative. And the plant, if you is going to have that same negative charge. And bees themselves have a positive charge, and the atmosphere has a positive charge. And so scientists have seen pollen jump from a flower to a bee that hasn't even landed on the flower because of that difference in charge. But I think what's even more interesting here is that when a bee lands on a flower, they alter the charge of that flower because they're bringing their positive charge into that negatively charged flower. And then when they leave again, that flower stays altered for a little while. And then the next bumblebee that passes along can read that charge and say, okay, I'm not going to visit that flower because it's recently been visited. So there's these just amazing things that that people have recently discovered. Similarly, hawk moths, which are mostly nocturnal, they visit flowers with long throats, and they hover in front of the flower and they unfurl their proboscis and they stick it in like a straw to drink the nectar. And again, they don't want to go through this level of effort with no reward. And there's bats that could eat them. It's all quite dangerous and cumbersome. And so the nectar in the flower, they have a method of sensing whether or not there's enough nectar in the flower to make it worth their effort, because the nectar is moisture, right? It's a liquid. And the hawk moths are very, very sensitive to moisture. And so they can actually sense in the area right outside of the flower, like a cloud of humidity. in that whole region and tell whether or not there's enough nectar in the throat of the flower in order to make it worth their while to actually stay and drink from it. And the last flower superpower, this was just discovered in 2018. Researchers found that a primrose can literally effectively hear bees, and that perfect satellite shape can pick up on the vibrations of a passing bee, and that the flowers will, within 3 minutes of hearing that bee, increase the sugar concentration in their nectar by 10 to 20%. And the researchers who found this, they did other tests to see if the plants would respond to any other similar vibrations like vehicles. And it was found that no, they do not respond to similar vibrations. They are specifically tuned in to hear the vibrations of bees and increase their nectar. So it's just these incredible processes that are happening all around us. So what are the flowers really offering pollinators, right? It's not just, some people get really excited when they see an Eastern bumblebee on, a coneflower, and it's really wonderful, but there's a lot, they're not just eating, right? There's a lot more going on besides that. But the main thing that they are getting is food, and the main food is, of course, pollen. And it's an absolutely necessary food for certain pollinators. But flowers will produce pollen both to reproduce and just to give it away in order to form those relationships with certain animals. Some flowers will even produce a non-fertile pollen that they'll make really available, and then special fertile pollen that they hide and just poke onto their certain pollinators where they're not suspecting it. But pollen is essentially protein. It's why people are so allergic to it. We're mostly allergic to proteins, and it's super cool and beautiful under a microscope. Those are all those amazing waxy coatings on the pollen. And once it gets onto a stigma, you can imagine that the receiving flower can be covered with pollen from all different species of plants as well, or just way too many grains. And so a lot of different plants have developed the sense to figure out which grains of pollen are on their stigma and to selectively allow only certain ones to germinate and grow their nectar or their pollen tube down. And so they can even stop certain pollen grains from germinating once they've even started. So there's all of these incredible things happening. The other big thing that the plants are giving away, of course, is nectar, which come out of nectaries. And they're most often these little cups. You can see down here at the bottom. And they're positioned so that pollinators have to, of course, brush past the stigma and the anthers to get them. But sometimes flowers like this hellebore will develop these fancy little nectar tubes right here. And there's all different interesting ways. And of course, some nectaries aren't even on flowers, like on peony, on the outside of peony buds or in prunus. They will have those little glands. People think that nectar first evolved elsewhere in the plant and then migrated mostly into the flowers. But nectar itself is, of course, sweet, and it gives pollinators the energy that they need to do their work, but it's a lot more than sugar water. It has amino acids and yeasts, and sometimes those yeasts will even ferment and it gets slightly alcoholic. And someone even argued a couple of years ago that butterflies should be considered omnivores because of all the crazy amount of things in nectar. I like to think of it as a tiny witch's brew, and it can even have drugs in it like caffeine and nicotine. And for animals that are drinking it, those drugs will function very similarly to the way that we use it. It will increase energy and memory. And so you can imagine from the plant's perspective, that's great to have like a super energetic, good memory pollinator flying around. That's awesome. But some people think that it even also is there, especially with nicotine, that it's also there to taste bad. And the thinking is kind of funny that that the nicotine flower on the nicotine plant, that the pollinator would visit, a hawk moth would visit and drink it and then be like, oh, yuck, this is gross. And then go to the next flower and just keep on doing that over and over. So they're actually pollinating faster and faster rather than hanging out and drinking all the nectar. They think that like tasting bad is part of their strategy. But it's a lot of effort, of course, to produce and refill nectar. And so a lot of flower shapes consider how to stop nectar from drying out and how to protect it from the rain, like the nectar spurs on this columbine. They're trying to protect it. And so a lot of our spring flowers are these bell shapes that hang down, because that's when there's a lot of rain that comes down. And of course, they're trying to protect them from also non-pollinating insects that want the resources. So this is a carpenter bee, and he is nectar robbing. He's using his strong mandibles to bite a hole into the throat of the columbine and bypass all the reproductive parts of the flower and just drink the nectar. And then once that hole is there, it's a free-for-all, and just everyone uses the hole. Nobody actually pollinates the flower. And one thing to note here with nectar before we move on is, again, that it is this witch's brew, and there are these amazing chemicals that are in the nectar, and there's a lot of evidence that bees and other pollinators will use these things medicinally in order to cure certain ailments, literally. And so again, when people are so excited about feeding the bees, I personally take the perspective that these things are so complicated. We can't just like look at a bunch of bees on a flower and say, hooray, this is wonderful. We've all succeeded, when really we should really be just trying to support the diversity of what is going on, because we don't know. We just don't know. You know, we can say, okay, this plant is really visited quite rarely by bees, but it's still really valuable because it might have some medicinal purpose or something else. There's just so much we don't know. And so it's really important, I think, to try and reconstruct these complex dynamics as best we can. Another thing that the flowers will offer is oils. On rare occasion, pollinators will collect oils from flowers, which they will then use to lure a mate. And of course, sometimes flowers just offer trickery instead of offering really anything, like orchids. They're really the great tricksters, and they make oils that smell like female bees so that the males will come and try and mate with them. And then they'd have other flowers, different species of orchids have flowers that look like male bees or wasps. And then the males will come and try and fight with them and pollinate them in the process as well. There's many wonderful lecturers out there just on orchid pollination. Scent is another way that flowers communicate, because the smell helps pollinators find the flowers, especially at night. Moth pollinated flowers like phlox and nicotine are far more fragrant at night. Bee pollinated flowers like roses have wonderful smells. A lot of us like the same things that bees like generally. This is a photo of scent glands, which are on the petals. It's the petals of flowers that really give off the scent. Beetle pollinated flowers like magnolias have a lemony, musky smell, but some flowers just don't have any scent. And especially those that are bird pollinated, because birds, they can smell a little bit, but they can't smell a whole lot. And so, with that, I could wrap it up. I could keep going a little bit into various animals, but it's 8 o'clock. And maybe the thing to do is to just wrap it up now and start the Q&A and answer any questions anybody has. And then of course I can share about specific techniques to encourage specific animals as well, if anyone has questions about that.
Thanks, Rebecca. Oh, there we are. There are both of us. Okay, first, thank you so much for this. This is a fantastic crash course in pollination ecology and so many of the variations. And as you said, there are so many more out there, but I think you gave us a real good sense of the range, especially with the insect pollinated plants. I also wanted to say that Charlie was absolutely right that this is a great time of year to be looking at these beautiful photographs you brought, not just to get a respite from the storm that's coming our way soon, but just to really take the time to think about what we can look forward to seeing now that you've given us a lot of clues about what the flowers we're going to see in the spring are communicating. So let's see, we've gotten a bunch of fun and interesting questions. I'm going to feed them to Rebecca. And so if anyone else wants to add some more questions to the Q&A feature, I will keep my eye on that as well and make sure we get to them, or as many as we can. For first, wanted to start with a question about the flower morphologies that you've made a really good case for specialist pollinators and specialist flowers being mutually dependent. And so what happens if we plant flowers that need a specialist to pollinate them, but our gardens are small and isolated from other patches that have those same native plants? Will they be found by the pollinators?
It really depends, you know, like, so we at the park, we have blueberries at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and we're in a really isolated situation. We're in the middle of the biggest city in the entire country, and we have a river on one side and a giant highway on the other. And so we've had blueberries there for a decade. And it took a decade for that blueberry digger bee to find us. And finally they came, which was like really exciting and wonderful. But those, you know, eventually many animals will find those resources when you do make them available. But it's always a good idea to have as many as possible, I think. So like, for instance, butterflies that are using certain plants as their host plant, those host plants are giving off VOCs, volatile organic compounds, that the butterflies and moths are able to pick up as they fly through the air from great distances. They can pick up tiny little molecules to say, okay, that host plant is there. I'm going to go, you know, spend my resources to go in that direction. And they can tell not only that you've planted milkweed or whatever other plant that you've planted, but also how much you've planted there. And so they have their ways of finding those resources. But there are also ways that we can design gardens in order to maximize them finding and utilizing those resources. This is a great time to be studying and interested in this stuff, because there's lots of research coming out about this stuff, about those links between gardening and ecology.
Thanks. I think we have two more like really related questions to some of the themes that you just brought up. And one is, it's a blueberry bush question wrapped in a story. So Susan had a blueberry bush for a few years that was not bearing fruit. She was told it was because she only had one plant that was either male or female, as you mentioned earlier. For her to get fruit, she needed to have a second plant of the opposite sex. But after a number of no berry years, the bush began producing lots and lots of berries. So her question was, did it pollinate itself? But it's sounding like something just finally found it and knew where to keep coming back to find it.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there. So blueberries, as far as I know, are not monoecious, which is the term for a plant having just one sex on one plant. They're dioecious. They have both teams in one house is the translation. And so, but some plants even then are not self-fertile, right? They won't be able, their own pollen, even if they have male and female flowers, they can't pollinate themselves. And so, what may have happened in that instance, there's a bunch of things, like maybe the plant just finally got healthy and was able to you know, produce fruit. Sometimes, especially newly established plants, blueberries can be pretty finicky, depending. But I think exactly as Helen, I think, said, that it's probable that pollinators just found it. And blueberry pollination is beautiful, tricky pollination where bumblebees and many native bees have this fantastic ability to buzz pollinate or sonicate, where they unhook their wing muscles from their actual wings and they use that to vibrate their bodies. And so on a blueberry flower, they'll hang upside down from the flower and vibrate themselves, and that pollen will just fall out of the flower and onto the bee. And that's the most effective method of pollination. There's a lot of flowers like tomato flowers where the anthers are actually little tubes, and the only way to pollinate them is through that sonication. And even in farms or greenhouses where they are growing tomatoes, they have vibrating mats that the tomatoes are actually growing on in order to make that pollination process happen.
Thanks. So another sort of seeking and finding question about pollination. Our garden aesthetic for animal pollinated showy flowers right now generally tends to have sort of clumping of same species flowers in an area rather than maybe the more or less structured intermixing that we see in natural settings a lot of times. And so from a flowers perspective, is clumping good for the plant as far as pollination success and seed set? And then I'll the other side after.
There's a great summary of this in entomology today, just a couple weeks ago. So I'm so glad that someone asked that question. So long ago, when I was just started this process, there was the thinking was always to plant flowers in blocks, because then they're mostly, you're thinking, okay, insects don't have great vision. They're going to see this giant section of pink and they're going to know to go to that. And so we would always, if we were trying to plant ecologically, we were always trying to plant in these big blocks. And then they found, lo and behold, that it really is so much more complex than that. That it has a lot to do with the individual pollinator dynamics and of course the individual plants themselves. But if you've ever been in the garden and seen like a honeybee kick a smaller bee off of a flower, which happens all the time, you can imagine that that smaller bee might be happy to go be a little bit farther away from that other bee. And so some bees they've seen, prefer to be away from a big group of flowers. And then they even found with rattlesnake master that rattlesnake master was best pollinated. It had more seed set when an individual flower was farther away from a clump. And so I studied under Daryl Morrison. I think he's wonderful, wonderful. He's a great native plant designer. And he would always tell me, plant in drifts. Everything should always be in drifts. And because that is how, nature designs essentially, that there's like a concentration and things kind of spread out a little bit. And I think to just complicate that a little bit, that's I like that look. That's like my favorite aesthetic. But really the thing to do is, of course, to look at the way that these flowers grow in wild and try and mimic that, and then let them sort it out to a certain degree. I'm an editor more than anything, that I think a lot of garden design happens in what you're removing over time as well, to just try and, you want diversity. In the end, like diversity is what it's all about.
Thanks. I think you already pretty well answered some of what the insect half of that question was, and the flower half. I guess I'll just move on to the next question because you did it really well. So for plants that spread by rhizomes or runners, like underground, sending up clones of themselves elsewhere, do they also get pollinated as well as the underground spreading?
As well as the underground spreading? Oh, it depends on the plant, so most, plants will, it totally depends, right? Like, if you think about Monarda fistulosa, that's a plant that is an incredibly aggressive spreader, wild bergamot, and they don't often reproduce sexually, but sometimes they do. Mugwort, same thing, right? It's like really aggressive spreader. You don't often find seedlings of mugwort, but sometimes they do. And sometimes some plants will seed in really prolifically, but won't really spread aggressively underground. It's always a trade-off, right? It's rare that a plant is going to do both of those things really aggressively, but then of course there's always examples of things like Japanese knotweed that will do those. So yeah, it just really depends on the situation and the strategies of that plant and what context they're in.
Thanks. There are so many good questions coming in. I love it. This one's an interesting one. So I feel like you partially answered this when you're talking about the variety of pollen shapes and the plant strategies for preventing invader pollen from the wrong species in a way. The different use of the word invader, it's not a invasive species, but the question someone asked was, does ragweed pollen stick to goldenrod? And so, I mean, when I read that, I thought there was like an invitation to talk about the specialization on the receiving end of pollen and the stigma, but I'm not entirely sure the person didn't mean like, can it stick and then you get it on you probably too.
I doubt it. I don't know, right? I'm sure that I'm sure at some point in history that has happened. But mostly what happens is that the way that we would breathe in ragweed pollen is that it's flying through the air. That it's not that we're like picking it up from something else and breathing on, that it's in the air and just flowing as we inhale more than anything. Any flower that you're going to pick up and smell is probably not going to give you a reaction. You might have a sensitivity to the smell, or like a fungicide that was used on the rose that you bought at the grocery store. But in general, the reaction from pollen is from the stuff that's already airborne.
Thanks. Somebody's asked a question about cultivars. So they wrote, what happens when plants are bred for extra petals, which we know is a very common thing.
Totally.
Are they still useful for pollinators?
Totally. Again, really depends. So the last slide of this presentation is a quiz, and there's those echinaceas that have, I think that's called like the cupcake series or something like that, where every single anther is a petal. And of course, in that situation, no, there's no pollination services that are being offered by those flowers, because for some reason, it's really easy for plants to switch between an anther and a petal. And so roses, peonies, cherries, all of those flowers, there's always cultivars that have been bred to have all of the anthers turned into petals. Of course, there are some that have had a third of the anthers turned into petal. And so there are, some pollen and some nectar still being offered by those plants, but they're definitely not providing as much of a service to pollinators. Of course, there's still a beautiful, right? Like a Kwanzaa cherry is stunningly gorgeous. But it always can be sad to see pollinators expending so much energy trying to get to the center of a peony that they're never going to reach, right? That it's like actually buried. So I still use some of those flowers. I love peonies, right? Like I can't control myself sometimes with that stuff, but I just make sure that when I do use them in a garden or have them in my own garden, that I don't count them towards the ecological benefit that I'm providing as a gardener.
That sounds like a good way to think about balancing on the course of your whole garden. Like there's the things you're putting in just for yourself, for your own enjoyment, and then the things you're putting in to support the local ecology as well.
Absolutely. And with cultivars, especially, like, there are some cultivars of turtle head, for instance, that I just absolutely love, like tiny Tortuga and hot lips. I think they're absolutely beautiful. And they have darker foliage and are not, Doug Tallamy told me, they are not actually good host plants for the butterflies that rely on turtle heads, because for that reason, when plants are bred with darker color foliage, oftentimes that darker color is made from anthocyanins. That's like a defense, and one of the functionalities is that it's a defense chemical, and animals don't like to eat it. And so certain animals don't like to eat it. And so it's again, I still use those in the landscape. Sometimes they just make things really beautiful and work together, but I try and keep it 80-20 is my personal ratio, where 80% of the plants that I use are there for ecological reasons, and then 20% can be just for the beauty of the garden.
Seems like a really helpful rule of thumb. Thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna mull that over some more as I think about my own garden at home. I'm sure other people will too. Heading out of the showy flowers, someone is asking a question about oaks. They said, I never see flowers on oak trees, yet they always have acorns. What type of flowers do oaks have, and what is their pollination strategy?
So of course they're wind pollinated, right? They're teeny tiny flowers. They're beautiful, beautiful flowers. After this, everyone should just go Google oak flower and you'll see them. And then you'll see them every year. They can be absolutely beautiful, tiny little things. Yeah.
They will end up on the ground too. So.
Yeah.
Are the silky parachute strings of a milkweed seed part of the fertilization process?
No, those are for distribution. But they do have a really wonderful functionality, I think, for pollinators. If you think about the ruby-throated hummingbird as a pollinator, that they are, if you leave the seed heads up, that ruby-throated hummingbirds will come through and gather them and use them as nesting material. And so we don't have ruby-throated hummingbirds that live in Brooklyn Bridge Park. They've traveled through. We're constantly watching to try and attract them to come and live in the park, but they've traveled through but never nested. And so, but we are always leaving seed heads up of milkweed and things like our native anemones that are also have really fuzzy seed heads, because we know that the hummingbirds will use those as nest material.
Thanks. Your photos using UV light were a lot of fun to look at. And there was a question asking if you could explain more about how you use that UV light at home.
Sure. So first of all, those weren't my photos. Those were from these internet groups where people do that. But so it's really fun. You can do some quick research online to find the right lights. They're all available on Amazon for like $10, but you do need to be careful because there are different wavelengths of UV. And I have this great old antique light that I was using in my bathroom to do this and get really good contrast of on flowers. And then it turns out that it was actually giving off radiation that's like causes cancer. And so you can't just use any UV light. There are safe ones out there, and a quick Google search can help you. I wish I could remember right now which are the good ones and which are the bad ones, but there's a lot of information now, and truly like whole chat rooms of people who do this together.
I don't doubt that that's true. There's so many topics out there. Another person wrote that they've heard that insect populations are falling. I would say like that's like understating the crisis in insects from a global perspective. But are you seeing that in Brooklyn Bridge Park or in your other travels, and how worried should we be and what can we do?
So, I mean, yes, it is a global like catastrophe that like threatens life on Earth. Like truly, it cannot be undersold. It's up there with climate change, the biodiversity collapse in general. And the studies about insect decline are staggering. It's like 45% in the last 50 years are the estimates. And then local studies can be even worse. The good news with that is that for many insects, it's not hard to get the populations to bounce back if you give them the proper habitat. They think that climate change, of course, affects insect populations in a lot of different places, but the big thing is disease and habitat destruction. And so that when we do create habitat that is welcoming in for these animals, that they can bounce back pretty quickly. And we've seen in the city, in Brooklyn Bridge Park, the whole idea of Brooklyn Bridge Park, one of the things we as a team are trying to do is figure out ways to construct ecology, because cities are growing, disturbances, will be with us forever. And so how can we create quality habitat within this disturbance, right? The most important thing any of us can do is protect existing wildlife habitat that is still out there and not destroy it. But we can also, where it already has been really compromised, we can build it ourselves. And as a park, that's like literally what we're doing. And we've seen things come back that haven't been seen in New York City before. We've had ladybugs. We had the first sighting of the two-spotted lady beetle in New York State in 30 years. We had the first walking stick ever to be seen on Long Island. We've had just really fantastic. We have a state threatened bumblebee called the Great Northern Golden Bumblebee, Bombus fervidus, that has like really thriving populations in the park. And so I think that a big part of that is having the native plants available. And then another part of that is effective management. And a lot of that is not disturbing your garden. As gardeners, a lot of the work that we're doing that is so well-meaning is actually totally destructive for habitat, like cut back and raking out all the duff and composting it and putting it back in, the vast majority of the wildlife that we're trying to attract is living in the duff over the winter. And when you rake it out, you're raking them out and wood chipping. And, so the more that we can find places in our gardens where we can just leave things alone, that's where we're really creating the best habitat for insects and also the plants and all of the other organisms as well. It might not be the front of a formal border that you do that, but if you have a larger property, maybe there's bigger areas that you don't cut back, or you can figure out ways to just like cut back edges and stuff like that, which is what we do at the park. Another big thing we're trying to do is change aesthetics so that we can get people to see landscapes that look natural as beautiful, right? Part of the problem is here is that we've been somehow sold this aesthetic of like barren mulch as taken care of, and then a natural aesthetic as messy and wild and neglected. And so we're trying to find ways to cultivate that wild aesthetic so that people can still see it as beautiful.
I think that's so important to this transformation, like a cultural transformation for us that you're talking about. As you mentioned earlier, that if you can provide the environment, the insects will come back. Their superpower is reproduction themselves too, right? So their generation time is short. They can make a lot of themselves pretty quickly. And so I think you're right that we do have an opportunity to really to play a role in stopping that crash. You mentioned raking as one of the destructive forces that we have, and you also mentioned leaving stems and not cutting back as aggressively as we maybe feel like we should to have a tidy yard. But I was particularly interested in if you could follow up about that kind of disturbance with raking. There's a lot of conversation in town right now because we have a referendum coming up in March about leaf blowers, particularly gas leaf blowers, but just the scale of disturbance about leaving things and versus raking versus leaf blowers. And sort of, I usually think about leaf blower destruction from the perspective of the insects that are trying to overwinter in the surface soil, the bees, but also moths and others. But thinking ahead about your talk tonight, I was thinking like, what about all the seeds that are falling to the ground too? And where do they end up when you're using a leaf blower?
Absolutely. So, the best thing that we can all do is nothing, right? Is just like, let it go. Or that's, there's a lot of sort of mythology around like not doing anything and having that be like the best approach. So that's it's not entirely true. Like just proper care is really the right move. And so it's, like if you have a lawn, you really do need to remove the leaves. That is what it is, right? Like you can use a leaf blower, which is horrible. You can mow them in, which is much better. You can rake them off and then compost them elsewhere. But if you're going to grow a lawn, you're going to need to remove leaves. If you're going to have a garden, you don't actually really need to remove leaves, depending on the plants. There are some plants that will get smothered by leaves. And then there are some plants that will happily grow through them. The vast majority of plants will happily grow through leaves. And it's just simply an aesthetic decision that people make to remove the leaves. But it also depends on what those leaves really are, right? Like if you have an oak tree with really tough leaves or a southern magnolia, probably not in Massachusetts, but we have those leaves are really thick and they take years to break down and they can absolutely smother plants beneath them. Whereas if you have a maple or ash, like those leaves will just disappear over the course of the winter. And so they're really easy to leave. And at Brooklyn Bridge Park, a lot of work that we do is kind of like, where are we going to remove the leaves up? We're going to map the areas that we're going to take them out of and leave them in certain areas and move them from one area to the next. And so it's a lot of work, right? It's not as easy as just saying, leave everything there and walk away and it's all going to be fine, right? Like certainly that might be the best thing in this day and age for supporting all of this wildlife, is just like leaving it alone for a few years and then figuring out a burn regime, right? Like that would be like the best the best plan, but it's not really realistic in most people's gardens.
Thanks. Another question related to falling insect populations as well, but also the plants. So as our climate continues to change, plant and pollinator geographic distributions are going to be shifting northward and up mountains, but not always at the same rates. And so do you think there's time for the evolution of flower shape to respond to new sets of pollinators that plants may encounter? Like, is that something that could happen on the time frame of the plants?
I mean, I hope so, right? I don't know. And I think, again, it probably really depends on the plants themselves and how much genetic diversity are within like local populations of, and like the, you know, plasticity there and their ability to change quickly. There's so many people looking at these things, and then there's big conversations in ecology, of course, around assisted migration and whether or not that's a good strategy.
I was going to ask you, is that something that you're doing in Brooklyn Bridge Park at all?
You know, it's not that we're like actively taking southern plants and planting them in the park. But one of the ways that we have been assisting with migration is with the Carolina mantis is our one native mantid in our region, and it's not supposed to live in New York City. It's supposed to have topped out in Pennsylvania. But we started seeing it in our park, and we also noticed that we're up to like 4 species of invasive mantids as well from all over the world, which are of course the giant ones that everyone sees. Then we would find them in our flower field, because we would see this like pile of monarch wings on the ground, and then find the Asian mantis especially. And so the gardeners decided to cull out the egg sacs of the invasive mantids over the winter as we were doing cutback, to like do a search for them and take them and remove them, and then selectively keep the egg sacs of the Carolina mantis and spread them around the park. And so we now have this thriving Carolina mantis population in the park, which is really unusual for the region. And you can see them now if you go on iNaturalist, which is this incredible resource for doing this work. You can see that their populations are moving north, even into Massachusetts as well. So we are technically assisting that migration simply by trying to keep out the invasive mantids. We're giving space for the native mantids to move in.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we don't have the native ones up here yet, but we have the others. So
they're much smaller. The native ones are really small comparatively.
Interesting to think about, like the intensive removal process you're doing in the park. It's a little daunting to imagine doing that in the forest here, but interesting to consider as well.
It's it's like weeding animals, but some people are really uncomfortable with it for obvious reasons. So it's a delicate thing.
It's way easier to think about removing egg sacs than squashing a mantid.
Yeah, or spotted lanternfly, right? We're all going to be doing that soon enough. So
right. Let's see. I want to ask if there's so many good questions here. I once read that butterflies can only remember a few flowers at a time, around 8 maybe. If this is true, do non-native flowers prevent butterflies from recognizing native flowers?
So I can't speak to their memory. I actually haven't heard that. I'll look into that. But yes, non-native plants do prevent their on occasion pollinators from visiting native plants. And there's a professor out of Massachusetts who does great lectures. There's a great lecture on the website for Grow Native Mass. His last name I think is Gager. And he talked about this experiment where there was this population of purple loosestrife and then a bunch of native flowers right around, and a wide variety of pollinators visiting the purple loosestrife. And when they mowed down the purple loosestrife, suddenly all those pollinators went and visited all of the native flowers. And his point, which is just a really excellent one, is that that it's not just about the bees, right? It's about the dynamic, and it's about these relationships these organisms have with each other. And so when there's an interrupter in there, if there's an exotic, then those native plants aren't getting pollinated, aren't reproducing at the appropriate rates. And so that's a big part of the dynamic, that it's not just about the bees, it's also about our native flowers as well.
So I think the information that you just gave us is going to lead us to your answer for this next question, but are there plants that are better for ecological reasons? We've heard Doug Ptolemy talk about the importance of oaks when you're trying to feed as many different caterpillars as you can. So I think this is coming probably from a similar kind of point of view, but you've been talking about how the diversity is really important, but what plants would be a good, just maybe a few that are a good base if you're starting a flower garden?
Sure. So I think some of the most fun plants that I love are plants that really show these dynamics to folks. So I love to plant Antonaria pussy toes, because it is a host plant for the American lady butterfly, and the American lady butterfly will reliably find it. And then you can just have it right there and watch this adorable little butterfly and caterpillar. And so those kinds of things are wonderful and educational for folks. I also think that, it's always really important to plant early flowering and late season flowering plants for the bees that wake up early and go to sleep late. And so certain things like willows are underplanted and really, really important from an ecological perspective, but really anything that's gonna flower in April that is a native plant is really good for so many pollinators. And then of course, asters and goldenrods. Asters and goldenrods are great, not just for pollinators, but also for birds. They're constantly on the list for the Xerxes Society, but also for the Audubon Society because of all of their seeds. And so a lot of these like powerhouse plants, but people get really caught up in like what's doing the most work, and that's like, it's really important to make sure that you have those bases covered. But any native plant that's native to your region is going to be doing a great service to all of the animals that rely on it and don't usually get to visit it. So it's not always amazing. It's not always the best strategy to just plant the things that are the most popular. Sometimes those like quirky, rare things are also really, really valuable.
Yeah, especially if everyone else already has all the other things in their yards nearby. You want to give something a little different. I think that's good advice. You were talking earlier about the scent that insects and occasionally birds use to locate flowers, and the other side of that is sometimes, especially when we have very young plants that we're trying to prevent being eaten by herbivores in our garden, there's a product called like rabbit scram or other things that are kind of stinky repellents that otherwise don't harm the plant, but will they also repel the pollinators? Do you know?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine that there is a good chance that would happen, that if there was an overwhelming scent, and that the pollinator is attracted by the plant's scent, that could be something that would interrupt it.
So if you were trying to save your brand new native plants that you just put in your yard from being killed by all of the bunnies that run through town, you might say only use that spray before flowers emerge in that garden bed. I mean, if that's assuming that you don't have flowers that go throughout the whole season yet.
Totally. No, I think for newly planted, if you're planting a plant and you know that you're going to have it for years, it's not the most important thing to have pollinators visiting those plants initially, right? Like I would really focus on getting it established, getting it healthy. And then in the following years, once it flowers, then have that be the service that it's providing and protecting it from rabbits, however you need in order to do that. Like I would sacrifice the flower initially in order to get the plant healthy and established. We had this instance with those American lady butterflies and the Anopheles, not Antonaria, but Anopheles that we had planted in the park. And we planted it in spring and they were so popular with the butterflies, that they were chasing us, and I had to like sweep them off the plant in order to plant them in the park. And they were just covered with butterflies, and then of course covered with caterpillars that ate the plants all the way down to the ground, and then the plants and the caterpillars all died. And it was like a huge disaster, right? And we learned the hard way that we needed to plant them in the fall. And again, like, get the plant healthy, get the plant established, protect them from the butterflies if need be, in order to get it established. And then once it can really thrive, then it becomes a resource for the animals that rely on it.
That's interesting when you have a resource that's really attractive and a really good food source, not just pollen and nectar source. I mean, that I think is driving some of why in nature we see plants not clumped in large groups, but sort of individually. It's that searching behavior by herbivores, and then also the natural enemies of them doing their own kind of intricate search to find them. So it is interesting to think about how pollination and herbivory all play together in how we design our gardens.
Totally.
And also, yeah, I think as the plants get bigger, it's easier to share it with the herbivores and with their, like the rabbits as well as the caterpillars. So I really appreciate your thinking about the time arc you're going to have your plant. The first couple years, you really are just trying to get them established. Do we have any plants native to the Northeast that are bat pollinated? Do you know?
I don't think so. I
Most
think you need to go to the like Midwest. We do have, we have prickly pear. There's a lot of bat pollinated cacti, but our prickly pear cacti is not bat pollinated, unfortunately.
Thanks. There were several requests, including for Girl Scout troops who are concerned about pollinator decline, and others interested in resources. So actually that might be a really good time to plug your newsletter that you've created as a great place to find that kind of information.
I'm so happy you brought that up. So I have a website, which is just my name.com, and you can go and sign up for my newsletter that I just started a couple months ago. But I really do try and add, it's really just as many resources that I can possibly distribute to folks about exactly this work. And things like how to design, how to place milkweed in the garden specifically to attract monarchs and stuff like that. Just trying to get that information out there. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, please go sign up there.
Thanks, Rebecca. And otherwise, I'm just seeing a lot of comments here of just gratitude, thanking you for recognizing that native landscapes are beautiful, and just thanking you for your answers and emphases of this great conversation tonight.
Thanks, it makes me so happy.
Yeah, I feel really happy about it too. I don't know if Charlie or Matt was going to come back on. But I'll say, like, this has been fantastic, Rebecca. Thank you so much for answering such a huge range of questions in addition to your fantastic presentation. And I'm seeing a lot more. If you want to take a peek at the chat, there's a lot of people saying thank you there too.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. It was absolutely my pleasure.
Rebecca, thank you so much. This has been terrific.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Rebecca. And this program was recorded and will be on the library's YouTube page if you would like to watch it again later.
And I'll just mention, we will be putting a link to this presentation after it comes out in the next Lexington Living Landscapes newsletter, and having it on our website as well. So for those of you who are used to looking there for information, we will make sure it's available as well.